Dudes, can a stick of gum actually help you eat less? That is the question we are going to try to tackle in this episode. We're going to take a look at if it can help with cravings, your fullness, and your overall intake, and maybe even if it's helpful for weight loss or not. So this information comes by way of a systematic review, and that systematic review is titled The Effects of Chewing Gum on Satiety, Appetite Regulation, Energy Intake, and Weight Loss. And this is by Jiménez and colleagues in 2025. So we'll dive into some of those things and some of the practical recommendations that I would make for a fitness enthusiast or someone who is looking to do a bit of dieting and incorporate gum as a tool in your arsenal to help you stick to the plan. So if you're interested in that or anything bodybuilding psychology related, hit subscribe and let's get to it. Now, a quick note that I wanted to make before we dove in. This was a systematic review and not a meta-analysis, so you couldn't really get a pooling of all the effects and the findings. And I think that is important to note because whenever you're trying to infer something from the literature, you want to make sure that you are tentative whenever you are drawing from a body of literature that is slightly heterogeneous. So what do I mean by that? So some of these studies looked at different flavors of gums. They looked at different timings of gum, so either a pre-meal versus post-meal. They looked at craving for sweet food versus salty food versus fatty foods. And some studies even looked at next meal fullness, and other studies looked at whole day fullness. So you were trying to bring together a whole bunch of studies that, yes, purport to look at gum and its effects on satiety. However, the variables that they looked at are all a little bit different. So we want to be careful in what we can infer, and I wanted to mention that up front. Now, let's get to some of the findings that I think are most interesting. So what can we safely infer from this systematic review? And then we'll get into application a little bit later. So number one, hunger and cravings for sweet things reduced. Now, in 5 out of the 7 RCTs, desire or cravings for sweetness decreased, and in 3 out of the 4 RCTs, decreased hunger was reported or found. Now, something to note that these reductions in desire were typically reported shortly after chewing gum. So had they tried to report on that a bit later, perhaps those findings would have been a little bit different, but typically, when you look across the studies, a decrease in hunger or cravings for sweetness was reported if you chewed gum shortly after a meal. Now, in aggregate, most of the gum chewing was done for about 10 to 20 minutes across the trials. Now, this varied. Again, it varied pre to post meal, but on average, it was around 10 to 20 minutes of gum chewing. Additionally, one RCT did show increased hunger, which kind of shows individual variability, which is something you would expect to find. I don't think there would be agreement across all RCTs, and so that's just something interesting to note. The number two thing that's interesting is that fullness after chewing gum was context dependent, and it varied across some of the studies. Some trials showed increased fullness, some trials showed no change in fullness, and some trials even showed a decrease in fullness. It really depended on when the gum was chewed and what type of gum was chewed. So you are going to be looking at the differences in mint flavored gums versus some of your fruit and or my favorite bubblegum flavored gums. So the other end of sort of the taste spectrum. Now, the cool thing about looking at gum in this way, the differences in mint versus fruit and other flavored gums, is the mint gums in the studies sort of acted as a palate reset. So if you think about it, it's sort of if you've ever had a fancy meal or anything like that, and you have multiple courses, they have these little palate resets that sort of allows your taste buds to resensitize for the next meal. Now, when you look at mint gum in this respect, it's sort of like brushing your teeth after a meal. You really don't want, or the sensation or desire to eat is drastically reduced after you've had sort of this mint flavor in your mouth. So with mint gum, that gives you some of the same effect. And so chewing mint gum post-meal can work to reduce some of those fullness cues. Similarly, if you look at other flavors of gum, again, back to my favorite, like bubblegum flavored or otherwise, some of these fruit and other flavored gums work to satisfy a sweet tooth. So if you're post-meal, and let's say the meal was pretty bland, because once you get into dieting and things like that, some of your food might get a little bland if you don't get creative with how you make it. The sweeter gums can substitute and maybe even stave off some of that sweet tooth, which leads to some possible binge eating. So make sure to look at what types of gums and when you're using them. Now, another interesting thing to note is that These gums sort of acted as a substitute for your sweet tooth. However, they showed inconsistent findings when it came to cravings for salty food, which I am a big fan of. I really love just rice cakes or the cheddar flavored rice cakes. So it wouldn't really help with that, or there are inconsistent findings with that. And then anybody who craves fatty or more sort of umami things, there were really no findings that it reduced cravings for that. So that's an area where you're going to have to take a look at yourself and see if this gum or chewing gum in between meals is going to help you. It really depends on your type of craving. Now, number three, shifting to something that's really important to most of us is energy intake or total daily energy intake. The findings weren't that great in terms of what we can infer for dieting purposes. So most of these studies weren't looking at individuals in a calorie deficit or trying to diet. A lot of these studies just looked at the effect on next meal intake and whole day intake. So we can't really infer too much from the effect on being in a calorie deficit or being in a calorie deficit for a prolonged period of time, which is an important caveat to have. I think we can still take some things from this, but that's something to keep in mind. So what the study found in terms of energy intake is it found acute reductions in calorie intake for next meal, which is great. But whenever you looked at everything together, the whole day calorie intake, it was kind of a wash. So perhaps if you chewed gum earlier in the day, it might reduce your next meal calorie intake. However, over the course of a day, you would just kind of naturally compensate. So calories for subjects across the studies, across the RCTs, generally stayed the same. So it was kind of wash for that. Number four, so the lengths of the studies were different, and only one of the RCTs was for 8 weeks. That was, I believe, that was the longest one. Now, why I bring this up is that was one that took a look at weight loss, and unfortunately, there were no findings that chewing gum in between your meals was beneficial for weight loss. Again, I want to point out that none of these studies were looking directly at dieting per se, but we're just looking at intake and compensatory intake throughout the course of a day. So no weight loss was noted in any of the studies, and I believe in the one study that was about 8 weeks, no weight loss was reported there either. So overall, number five, why might this actually work? So if you take a look at the review, I think we can conclude that the gum sort of acts as a distraction or a palate reset. What am I always preaching in this channel? One of my favorite quotes: between stimulus and response, there's a space. And the only thing we're really trying to do is we're trying to magnify that space so that you can make better decisions. And this becomes even more so important whenever you're in a calorie deficit. If we can find a way to magnify that space between stimulus and response, between seeing something we want to eat and deciding whether or not we want to eat off plan, between someone asking us to go out to eat and picking something crappy on the menu versus picking something a little bit more aligned with our dieting goals, we want to magnify that space, those stimuli, and how we respond to them. And if gum can be inserted there and give us more time to think, give us more time to use some of our frontal lobe, which your brain utilizes glucose quite a bit for energy. And when you're in a calorie deficit, you're going to have less glucose going into your brain. So thinking, there you go, thinking might be a little bit more difficult. Gum can act as a distraction and sort of magnify that space between when you think of something, when you have a desire or urge to do something, and how you respond. So that is something I think we can infer. But what does that mean practically? Let's take a look at some of the applications. So number one, you can use gum whenever cravings hit. So it doesn't really matter if you are a mint gum person or a fruit gum person, just whenever cravings or hunger hits and you're dieting, and let's say the spread of your meals, you're eating, let's say 4 meals a day, and there's a little bit more time in between your meals than say eating 5 meals a day, and a craving hits, you can have a piece of gum or a couple of pieces of gum, and that should really help to stamp out the cravings. Just like I said, for me, I like the Pur gums, Pure Pur. I'm not sure. It's a xylitol-based gums, and I've even had dentists and hygienists recommend xylitol-based gum. So any type of xylitol-based gum that you can find to have in between meals, not only is that going to be beneficial for, again, creating that space between stimulus and response, there's a space. Not only is it going to extend that space, but it's going to be good for your teeth, which is a great sort of benefit that isn't even talked about in any of these studies. Now, if you have just eaten a meal and you still find yourself hungry, So to act as a palate reset, you can sort of shift towards more mint flavored gums, and those are going to be better for resetting your palate so that you can tamp down on some of that hunger. So how long do we want to chew a gum? Not that this makes a huge difference, but in the studies, they did note 10 to 20 minutes, 1 to 3 times a day. Now, I have talked to a dentist in the past, and whenever discussing xylitol gum, they had mentioned around 3 or 4 times a day, probably close to 3 times a day. If you want to use it for dental sort of hygiene purposes, again, don't quote me on that. I'm not a dentist. Double check with your dentist. But I think 3 times a day, chewing for 10 to 20 minutes is probably going to be a sweet point for time and frequency. Last thing to note, the FDA allows producers of food items, if their food is below a certain calorie threshold, to label and mark that food as 0 calories. That is not necessarily true. There are going to be trace calories, 1 to 3, 1 to 4 calories, in foods that are labeled as 0 a lot of the time. And if you are dieting for a bodybuilding contest, racking up the diet sodas, racking up the sugar-free and 0 calorie gums, if you have tons of those things in a day, those calories will add up. Those calories can add up to hundreds, hopefully not hundreds, but hundreds of extra calories in a day if you are not careful and if you are in a deep enough calorie deficit. So that is something that I would be aware of. I would limit myself to 3 to 4 servings of the gum a day. And then also, if you are dieting and you have the diet sodas in there too, just remember you're going to get trace calories from that. And if you are a person who also likes condiments, like 0 calorie condiments like mustard, no, it's going to be labeled at 0, but there are going to be some trace calories in there. So keep that in mind whenever you start adding these things onto your diet. These trace calories are going to add up. So there really are just trade offs here. Now, one psychological thing you could do is to rate your craving immediately before you chew the gum. So, what's this going to do for you? This is going to allow you to take a second measure later after you've chewed the gum for 10 to 20 minutes. So, let's say you feel a craving come on in between meals or immediately post meal. If you want to rate that craving on a scale of 1 to 10, like, I'm pretty cravey. The meal was good, but, 6, 7. I really do want a piece of X, Y, and Z thing. Then you have your gum, whether that's the palate reset with the mint, or if you're craving something sweet and you have a fruity type gum, you rate that at a 6 or 7. You have the gum, you chew it for 10 to 20 minutes, and then you rate your cravings again later. More often than not, you'll find is that by creating that space between stimulus, ooh, I want this, I must have this, and response, instead of having the thing, I'm going to turn into something else. You probably have tamped down on that craving. So um, rate your craving before you chew the gum, rate your craving after you chew the gum, after you've created that 10 to 20 minutes, and then see where you're at. I think a lot of the time you're going to find that your craving is greatly reduced, and that allows your body more time to digest the meal you just had, which more often than not, that's what a lot of us need to do instead of allowing ourselves to fall into these cravings. Alrighty, folks, just remember gum can be a very useful tool in your arsenal whenever you are in a calorie deficit and you want to sort of extend your eating window or tamp down on some of those cravings. Treat any conclusions that I've drawn with a grain of salt, and remember to not eat too much gum because those trace calories are going to add up. So I hope that was helpful. And if you're interested in anything bodybuilding or bodybuilding and psychology related, hit subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next episode.